Okay, we're recording. So, thank you all very much for joining us today. This is the first in this year's series of Talk Grasslands. This was a program that was initiated 1 year ago by my colleague Didem, and as a response to the COVID situation, that in the Dry Grasslands group, we've been used to having a very active program of events, conferences, meetings, field workshops, and we needed to do something to keep us occupied when it wasn't possible to organize these things. So we organized this series of winter season of talks last year. This year, similarly, we have 3 presentations. One today by Martin Diekmann, one in December by Paolo Biella, and then the last one of the series in January will be given by Jitka Klimashova. So today's presentation will be given by Martin Diekmann from the University of Bremen. Martin's been very active in this area for a long time and is very familiar to us in the EDGG. He was the president of the IAVS through most of the period that I've been active in the EDGG. And today he's going to give us a presentation about driving factors of long-term vegetation changes in grasslands. So please, Martin, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. So I will try to share my screen. I hope you can all see my screen.
Yeah, it's there now.
Perfect. Okay. Yeah, Stephen, thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation to give this talk. I'm very happy to be here. I have been from the beginning more I would say a forest ecologist, but when I moved to the north of Germany, to Bremen, I realized that forests are relatively scarce here. So it was meaningful to specialize more on grasslands. And although I'm still working with forests, let's say most of what I'm doing in the field now it has to do with grassland ecology. And I will try to tell you a little bit about research I've been doing, not only about the changes that are going on in semi-natural grasslands, but especially also the environmental drivers that cause these changes. And whenever you have questions, don't hesitate to ask. I hope I see that when you have a question already during the talk, but then otherwise I hope that we have a lively discussion after the talk is over. What I'm going to do is I will shortly talk about some factors that you all know make up global change. I will show you some introductory examples of vegetation change in grasslands. And then I will have a first part where I will try to show you that there are various ways to learn something about the drivers of change. And I will then more explicitly talk about the time series analysis and studies that I've been doing. And we will start from relatively simple examples, or let's say examples where the drivers are relatively clear, to examples where the whole thing is more complicated. And we will end the talk with a couple of conclusions. So global change is, of course, composed of a lot of different effects, and it's impossible, of course, to talk about all these things. But at the same time, we know that vegetation is affected by a lot of different things. So when the climate changes, that obviously has also consequences for the composition of our plant communities. We have habitat destruction, habitat modification, for example, the enrichment of nutrients. We have processes that affect especially the population ecology of species such as habitat fragmentation, but then we have a lot of other things like land use change, the effects of invasive species, and so on. And that makes it, I would say, difficult to analyze the environmental drivers, but at the same time also quite exciting to try to look at the joint effects of all these changes. Now, what are our options to study vegetation changes? I start with a simple example from a publication we had a couple of years ago. It's a wet grassland area, like many of the areas here around my university from northern Germany. And if you, for example, compare vegetation plots, historical ones with more recent ones, resurvey ones, then you can, for example, by using a ordination analysis, show that obviously something is going on. So you see here we have the location of all the sites of the old plots, and with the corresponding numbers, we have the position of the new plots in an ordination diagram. And you all will agree that obviously something is going on if there is a systematic change of the position of the sites from left to right, except this poor plot 52 that managed to keep its old vegetation more or less. So we can look at species composition. We can, of course, also look at species richness, and then it's even more dramatic. Here you have a kind of frequency distribution of the changes in species richness between new and old plots. If nothing changes, you would be at 0. So this is the red line, and all the plots, and you see it's all plots, in fact, all 52 plots, is situated to the left, meaning plots have lost species over several decades. And the mean species loss in these sites is more than 20 species per site, which is dramatic and shows that at least in these wet grasslands, something is going on. If you look at an example from dry grasslands, this example is from Bavaria and Germany, you see again something is going on. So there is a kind of displacement of the plots from old to new, but you see that the differences are not so pronounced compared with the wet grassland. So we see a kind of change, but it's slower, obviously, and it's less dramatic. And the same is true if you look at the differences in species richness. While most plots have lost species, there are in fact also some plots that have gained species. So there is again change, but to another extent compared to the wet grasslands. Now, we already 2 years ago in a paper in Journal of Vegetation Science, we tried to somehow summarize some available information from semi-natural grasslands from Central and Western Europe to examine in how far they have changed. And during or in this meta-analysis, we mainly tried to describe the patterns. Of course, we were also interested in the driving factors. But as you will see, if you have no environmental measurements available, and this is often the case with time series data, then of course you can speculate, but it's not always easy to really know what's going on. And just again, some examples from this study here. For wet grasslands, we were able to compile about 13 data sets. And as you can see, when you plot the response in the form of a response ratio on the y-axis against the years between the surveys, between historical and new survey, you see that most grasslands, wet grasslands, lose a lot of species, and they especially lose wet grassland specialists. And that is already something I would like to point out. It's always useful, and I would say even necessary, not only to look at total species richness as a kind of descriptor for compositional changes, but you need to divide the total of your species into different species groups, for example, specialists and generalists. You can then, of course, try to kind of interpret what you see. So looking at dry grasslands, not only from Germany, but also from the UK, you see that sometimes responses are very mixed. So you see here that in some cases you lose species, in other cases you keep species, or there is even an increase in the total number of species. Similar pattern you see if you look at the number of dry grassland species. But then you would want to understand what is the driving factor. And we will, during this talk, often come back to these Ellenberg indicator values, which offer one of the few possibilities we have when we analyze old data sets for which we usually have no environmental variables available. And then what you can do, most of you know that you can kind of calculate mean numbers for plots and compare the mean numbers between historical and new plots, and in this way try at least to understand or to explain what's going on. So in this particular example, you see that obviously in these resurveys running over a long time, 50, 60, 70 years, the mean numbers for nutrients or nitrogen increase, which could be one reason, but it's not necessarily nutrient enrichment that drives this change in species composition or also in species richness. So what can you do in general to know about or to find the drivers of change? And I will mention three basic possibilities that you have. One is, of course, doing experiments. So this is one of the famous experiments from Characterizes Grasslands from the Netherlands 30 years ago, where nutrients were added to experimental plots. And if you do this, you can, over several years, observe what's going on and how the vegetation changes. So that is one possibility that you have. A second possibility is that you apply spatial gradients, meaning you, for example, study a certain vegetation type, semi-natural grassland type. You study it in a lot of different sites across different regions, across different countries. And then you try to relate the patterns that you see in species richness or grasslands to differences between the countries. And this we did for acidic grasslands a couple of years ago, when we were interested in the question whether perhaps nitrogen deposition in these grasslands affected species richness. So this was is the map where we studied grasslands with a very strict methodology. You see it ranges from the south of France to Ireland, Scotland, but also the southwest of Norway. And if you define your vegetation type in such a way that you really sample only a certain type of vegetation, then you can try to look at the spatial differences, but you would interpret them perhaps as a kind of time series when you see that some of the potential environmental drivers differ between the different countries. And as we know that, for example, the deposition rates are relatively low in Ireland or in Norway, we can compare the sites with areas where we know that deposition values are high, such as in Belgium, the Netherlands, or in Germany. And what we found at that time was that it was quite obvious that the higher the end deposition was, and this is a purely spatial gradient, the fewer species we found in these grasslands. So here we use a spatial gradient to assess time changes. Well, the third possibility is obviously temporal comparisons, which I will talk about for the rest of this talk. And the example we started with from wet grasslands is published in 2017, where we had a simple revegetation study from an area close to the city where I live and work. And that is another approach where you really try to find data that are old enough to allow you to do a comparison in order to see whether vegetation has changed in response to changes in environmental factors. And what you can do is you can compare these three approaches in order to see which advantages or disadvantages they have, or which strengths or weaknesses. And I will not stay too long with this graph, but I think it shows quite well that, of course, experiments are highly important and relevant because they allow us to change something, keeping confounding or potentially confounding variables constant, and by that relatively easily do an interpretation of how environmental changes drive changes in species composition. So this is something experiments can do much better than any spatial or temporal gradient. But you see also that experiments have their limits or problems. And this is especially that they are mostly short-term, because usually it's difficult logistically and so on to run experiments over a longer time period. And also, you can always argue that their realism is limited, because what you do is you just change one factor usually, or perhaps two, but we know the vegetation is exposed to a large number of potentially driving variables. And this could be the advantage of temporal comparisons, which are often long-term, which have a high degree of realism because they happen in the field and you can observe it. You can then break down temporal comparisons again in different types of temporal comparisons. And I will argue that especially semi-permanent plots, which we will talk about later, have a lot of advantages. And this is a combination of the fact that quite many data are available, in contrast to permanent plots, which are very rare. And at the same time, they give you the possibility to interpret the results, because the number of confounding variables, it's much smaller than if you just do a time series data analysis, not being able to rely on a constant location of the plots. So we will especially look at the potentials that the resurvey of semi-permanent plots allow us in order to interpret what's going on in our grasslands. So there are unfortunately a lot of different types of semi-natural grasslands. I just show you some of the ones that are especially relevant in the area where I live or not too far from here. So we have different grassland types, and I will not specifically show you examples of hay meadows on mesic soils, simply because the data availability is less good than for the other types. We are working on this, however, because a PhD student of mine, she has done a large resurvey study of arenatarian meadows in the middle of Germany, and hopefully we will be able to analyze and publish that data set next year. But I will, in the following, focus on three different semi-natural grassland types. We will start with hay meadows on wet soils, continue with acidic grasslands, and finish this talk with calcareous grasslands. We will also look at different potential drivers. And again, I will not talk about habitat destruction as a driver, because if you turn a meadow into a forest, then the driver is pretty clear, I would say, and there's nothing which is particularly interesting from a vegetation point of view. I will also not talk about habitat fragmentation, which I think is not the main cause of vegetation changes, although it may affect, of course, the abundance and probability of survival of species that suffer from habitat fragmentation. But I think that would go too far for this talk. So what I will do is I will mainly talk about habitat modification, so changes that, for example, are brought about by nitrogen deposition or changes in the acidity of the soil. I will talk about land use change, which is management, for example. And I will at the end also talk about climate change as a potential driver. Let's start with wet grasslands. So in the back, you see my university with this famous tower, which is part of the technology park around our university. And here in the foreground, you see a nature reserve, the Hollerland, which is a wonderful wet meadow reserve with extremely species-rich ditches and one of our favorite places to do studies. So it's very convenient because it's just 10 minutes walk from my office here. In this meta-analysis of semi-natural grasslands, I showed you already a related slide. We saw that most wet grasslands had turned into something completely different. So we know that species composition had changed. We know that in most cases, there was a tremendous loss in species, but at the same time, we also have seen that sometimes the grasslands, especially if they are part of nature reserves, manage to have a more or less stable species composition. In most cases, in wet grasslands, the reasons for the changes are relatively simple to understand. So in the lowlands of Germany, wet grasslands could, without bigger problem, turn into productive agricultural land. And what you have to do is you have to drain, you have to fertilize, you have to lime, you have to increase the mowing or grazing frequency or intensity. And by that, you turn a wet grasslands rich in species to a relatively monotonous grassland dominating by a few species. And by using Ellenberg indicator values, you can easily show what's going on. So in the left-hand graph, we see that over the long run, there is a decrease in the moisture values, indicating that typically wet grassland species have lost, and other species able to survive in drier soils, they take over. And that is associated also with an increase in mean Ellenberg N values. So in most cases, this is what has happened in most parts of the North German lowlands. There are some exceptions. I already mentioned that, for example, in nature reserves. So this is an area close to our city here that has been kept as an important area, especially for bird conservation, since about 20 years. And we did a statistical analysis of a big monitoring program that's going on. And if you just plot different plots with our plot numbers across time, you see that there is no, I would say, systematic change in species composition. So there's a wild mixture here of colors, indicating that this has been relatively stable in its species composition and also species richness. But this is an exception. Whenever you have or had wet grassland areas which are not part of a nature reserve or any action program of nature conservation agencies, then they change. And we are lucky that we have quite a number of data sets available. This is one of the most famous one, I would say, because this is a map we suddenly discovered in the basement in a cupboard, which is an old vegetation table from the 40s, so a long time ago, of wet grasslands in an area northwest of Bremen, or sorry, west of Bremen. Here is the city, here is the river Weser, and here is the so-called Stedinger Land. And you see that even the spatial location of the plots is indicated quite well. And we were able to resurvey these sites. And if you look at the list of species, you probably can start to cry, because you see a lot of species that have largely disappeared from the area. All these typical species of wet grasslands that have become rare and part of the red list. So here are 3 examples, species which can still be found, but only in nature reserves, I would say. Senecio aquaticus, Latyrus palustris, Salictrum flavum, all parts of the red list, at least in the lowlands of our country. So I will in more detail show you what's going on in one area that is particularly well studied. It's an old it's called Moor, but it's not a true Maya any longer, but it's more a grassland area. And we have 3 time series records available. It was first described by Dierschke already in the 60s. Then there was a resurvey in the late 80s and another resurvey about 15 years ago. And when you look at the changes, you see that some of the changes occur very fast. For example, the local extinction of species, but some also take some time. That means also that if you have a change in the environmental drivers, some of the effects will happen relatively soon, but others may take decades to observe. And that this is or can be a slow and continuing process. You see, for example, by looking at the cumulative species richness that is declining. And while we had about 146 species in the area about 50, 60 years ago, the total number of species is lower than 50% compared to the original number. And this is also obvious in the average species richness in the plots. And the dramatic thing is this: we know that the land use intensification happened especially during the 60s and 70s, and this is reflected in this steep decrease in average species richness from here to here, or from here to here. But this is still continuing. So even 20 years later, we still see a decrease in the number of species. And we, in fact, plan to revisit this area a 4th time, perhaps next year or in 2023. And we are convinced that there again will be a decrease in the average number of species. So this is a continuing process. So it's not that we have stopped this change, at least in the areas which are still exposed to a very intensive land use. This is accompanied again by, as I already showed, a strong, pronounced difference in species richness. So again, most of the plots, they lose 10 or 20 species. And even if you look at the second time period, you see that the majority of plots still loses species. So some species, they may be able to survive even under unfavorable environmental conditions, but the longer this intensive land use with fertilization, efficient drainage, liming, and so on goes on, the more species will be lost. And this is again reflected in the mean Ehrenberg indicator values, where moisture values decrease while nitrogen or nutrients and pH increase. And this is relatively easy, I would say, to interpret, because we know what the farmers do and the things they do to their sites is reflected in the species composition. And this is how the grasslands may look like today. We have seen this slide with the 3 rare species. Well, this is like how an intact wet grassland looks like, and this is what you usually have now in the intensively used agricultural area of the lowlands. You have a relatively homogeneous, I would say boring species composition with just a few species in your plots. One of them, which is a big dominator in many of these grasslands, is Alopecourus pratensis, that has replaced many of the other grass species that were more important in earlier times. We turn to acidic grasslands. Now, this is a completely different case, because many of the acidic grasslands, which nowadays are especially found in mountainous areas of our country, they have partly turned into land that farmers use for agricultural purposes. They have sometimes also turned to forest, but in many cases there will be nature conservation agencies will try to keep them open and to preserve their typical species composition. So here you see a picture from one of our student excursions where we try to do a sampling in one of these plots in the Harz Mountains. We know that over the last decades, even acidic grasslands have changed a lot. So this is a time series analysis of acidic grasslands from all over Germany. And these different color codes show you when the samples were done. And well, by just looking at the colors, you see that even here there is a systematic change going on from the 40s, where most of the plots are situated here, to the 50s, 70s, 80s, and the more recent times. The question is, how have these acidic grasslands changed, let's say, over the last 2 or 3 decades, when nature conservation was more active and tried to keep these acidic grasslands in a good shape? And I show you soon the results of a recent study that was published just a couple of weeks ago. But I would like to show you this species, which is a kind of symbol, at least in the North German lowlands, for the decline of these acidic grasslands. This has been a species, Arnica montana, which occurred in most areas of the north, and it's one of the rarest species now because it obviously cannot cope with the environmental changes going on. So I will show you the main results of this study that has just been published. And it's interesting because it is a resurvey of a study initially done in '86. And since then, nature conservation has tried to really actively promote the management of these areas in order to preserve the species composition. And some of the results, I would say, are quite surprising, because it doesn't reflect what has been going on in previous decades. And one of these surprising results is seen in this figure. Now, these acidic grasslands were divided into 2 different, well, not grassland, but habitat type, I would say, the typical Nardus grasslands and sites that were mostly dominated by ericaceous heathland species. And I would point your attention to this here, to this part of the figure. This is the change in the topsoil pH from '86 to 2018. And as you can see, in both the Nardus grasslands and also the wet heathlands, pH values increased. And this is a trend that is completely different from the trend that we have seen in the comparison of sites in the 40s or 50s with sites in the 80s or 90s. And the reason is probably that here there has been a recovery of pH values, simply because the sulfur deposition that has long been very high and that has been stopped by legal actions has decreased to about 10% of its former level. And that has obviously had the result that the soils recover. And a pH recovery is very, very important, because we know from experimental studies, but also from laboratory studies, that many grassland species, and Arnica montana is one of them, have problems with low pH. That has several reasons. That has to do with the pH itself, but also with a high aluminium solubility at low pH, but also with the availability of different forms of nitrogen. So this pH recovery potentially allows many Nardus grassland species to grow here again. Maybe they have been lost, and potentially they have the possibility now to again occur in these sites. The question is, have they come back, or will they come back, or what is the effect of land use management that also needs to be okay in order to allow the species to occur in such sites? And this is again an ordination diagram which shows you what has been going on over these 3 decades. The reddish color is for the Nardus grasslands. The bluish color is for the wet heathlands. Both grassland types change, but the Nardus grasslands change not as much as the wet heathlands. The direction of change is as expected. It follows the trajectory for pH, meaning that the grasslands positively respond to an increasing pH, but at the same time, the number of typical Nardus grasslands or acidic grasslands is more or less stable. So it's not that there is a strong recovery of these species. And one reason may be that the species have been lost from the areas, so there is nothing to recover because long distance dispersal is highly unlikely. But another reason may be that such a recovery of pH and perhaps a certain increase in the amount of nutrients not only favor the typical acidic grassland species, but also species which we call agricultural grassland species. So species which are better or faster in responding to improved conditions in terms of a higher pH or more nutrients. The changes were more pronounced for the wet heathlands, and that has to do with management, because the management that was reintroduced by the Nature Conservation Agency was obviously quite good for the grasslands, but not very good for the wet heathlands, because these the different species of the family Ericaceae, they cannot really cope with mowing as the Nardus grassland species can. So here, the changes are also an effect of the land use change that is good for one habitat type, but not for another one. And if you look at the changes in different species groups, you will see that the Nardus grassland species, they tend to be rather stable, while the wet heathland, typical wet heathland species disappear from the sites, despite the fact that a management has been reintroduced. While the winners, despite the reintroduction of management and despite an increase in pH, the winners are the more common agricultural grassland species, but also indicators of abandonment. So here in these acidic grasslands, we see that there is a combination of changes in edaphic soil conditions that we would expect to favor the species that we want to preserve, but at the same time, management is not necessarily favorable for the communities we would like to have. I turn to a last type of grasslands, calcareous grasslands, which we already 7 years ago tried to look at in a kind of time series analysis across the northwestern parts of Germany. And one important pattern that we saw, but again, based not on true measurements of environmental variables, but based on mean Ehrenberg indicator values, was that, of course, species richness is dependent on the nutrient availability, but as you perhaps would expect from theory, in a unimodal way, meaning that calcareous grassland sites with a moderately low nutrient availability are the ones that have most species, while species numbers go down when you have very infertile sites or relatively fertile sites. But of course, if you just look at the typical dry grassland species or the specialist species, you could say, then you have a very clear, more or less linear pattern, meaning the higher your nutrient availability is, the lower is your species richness of these group of species. And that means that any eutrophication of such grasslands would result not necessarily in a drop in total species richness, but in a drop in the share of specialist species. When we looked at the temporal changes over time, these were not very pronounced. So total species richness showed a slight, significantly, but very weak increase, just a couple of species per plot, while the proportion, but also the number of typical grassland species showed a weak decline. But in general, I would say the differences between plots from the 40s or 50s and more recent plots were not very pronounced. So this is a good message, of course. So obviously, nature conservation is able to keep these grasslands in a good shape, but there are changes, despite the fact that the overall change is not very pronounced. And that you can see by looking at the, on a species level, the amount of decreasing and increasing trends over time. And here you see that despite the fact that changes are not very strong, there is an increase in the general species and a decrease in the typical dry grassland species. And that is similar again to what we have seen in the Nardus grasslands, where the specialists more or less were stable, but the generalist species increased. So, for example, Daucus carota, as you can see here, that is a species that has increased over the several decades in dry grasslands, while such rare grassland specialists like Spirantes, spiralis, they have decreased or disappeared. In my last example, I will show you that it's important not only to, I would say, to analyze habitat types or semi-natural grassland types as a whole, but to try to distinguish different subtypes in order to learn more about the environmental drivers. And I will show you a study that we just submitted, where we looked at the response of the vegetation over the last 10 years, where we believe that drought spells have caused a lot of changes that we would not be able to see if we analyze this grassland type as a whole. So the initial survey was done in 2008, and the resurvey was done by Leonie Mazzala, a PhD student of mine, 2 years ago. So just 11 years. And the important thing is that this study was done in a relatively restricted area of Northwest Germany with a more or less uniform climate, I would say. So we are still in the sub-oceanic part of the country. So we have no grasslands included that, for example, are in the rain shadow of the Harz Mountains. So these grasslands have relatively similar, climatic conditions, but also when it comes to the soil environment, they are comparable. And what we did was that we, resurveyed these 25 plots that we had in 2008, and we resampled them in 2 ways. And this is not a part of what I will tell you, but this is part of the manuscript we submitted. We relocated these plots in 2 ways. First, we just tried to relocate the plot by using a GPS, and in the second time, we did a relocation by using the magnets that we had hidden in the soil 11 years before. And this was simply in order to see in how far GPS relocation in your reanalysis gives you similar results to the ones that you get when you use magnets. And although I will not show you the results, they are exactly the same. So GPS relocation, at least in grasslands, is a relatively, at least here in this example, relatively safe measure to recover trends in species composition. Now here you see a map, or a lot of maps from Germany, and the reddish brown colors, they are an indication of the drought intensity. Until 2008, when the first survey was done, you see that except in 2003, when we had an extremely dry year, there were hardly any years, especially in the north, when there were really drought spells or years when it was too dry. And this has completely changed. You see, after 2008, you have a lot of this color, 2011, 2012, 15, but especially 18, 19, and 20, were extremely dry years. And we expected that these drought spells would have an effect on the species composition, even in dry grasslands, which we usually assume to be relatively well adapted, I would say, to dry conditions. And in order to see whether different types of dry grasslands experience these droughts in a different way, we distinguished 2 site types. One group was grasslands that were on small hills, on the flat part of the hills, or were north facing. And the second group were the more sun and drought exposed south facing slopes, are those that are much steeper. So all dry grassland plots were either assigned to this group 1 or this group 2. Now, if we first look at the response of our grasslands over these 11 years, we can say that obviously the drought spells have had a positive effect on the whole, because there is a significant increase in the number of character species of calcareous grasslands, both looking at their cover or at the number of species. So this is definitely something good. The total number of species is stable. The cover is even decreasing. Even that was to be expected, because the drought spells made that there are more gaps in the vegetation, that some of the more dominant species died off. So just looking at the whole of all grassland species, we can say that these dry years had positive effects on the grasslands, although ruderal species also tend to increase in response to respond positively over time. The pattern changes, or let's say the conclusion changes, when we distinguish the 2 site types. So if we compare calcareous grassland sites on north-facing and south-facing slopes, we can see that the north-facing ones, the less extreme ones, they win in terms of the total number of species, in terms of the number of specialist grassland species, but even other groups of species. So the less extreme calcareous grasslands respond from a nature conservation point of view, positively to the drought spells of the last decade. But the opposite is true for the south-facing slopes. So here you can see that the median numbers and the bars, both for total species richness, but also for the share of specialist grassland species, is below the 0 line, meaning that the most extreme slopes, despite the fact that all the species there are adapted to dry conditions, they lose species because conditions probably are so extreme that many of these species disappeared after these drought spells. And this is a kind of prediction of what might happen if these drought spells become more extreme or will happen even more often than it has been the case of the last years. So perhaps the site type as a whole will still survive, but the more extreme sites will lose species. And that has, of course, a consequence for the, even for the conservation policy, because some of these very extreme sites, they may not be able to keep up their typical species composition over the long run. And I think this is an important message that, and this is perhaps the slide that is closest to the effects of climate change, which we really cannot see very much of in the wet grasslands or in the Nordic grassland, but in the calcareous grasslands, climate change is definitely a factor that we need to take into account when we try to interpret the changes and look at, for example, soil variables and management. So I think here climate change may be even the most important or an overriding factor when we interpret the vegetation changes that are going on. I would like to summarize what I've shown you in a couple of statements. Of course, that's not a surprise. The extent of vegetation changes varies a lot between the different grassland types. Very strong, usually in the wet grasslands, less pronounced in Nardus or in acidic grasslands or calcareous grasslands. But especially the drivers are different, I would say. So the factors that shape grassland types and the changes in grassland types differ a lot. So it's not meaningful really to believe that you have to analyze the same things if you change from one grassland type to another. Usually we know that most environmental changes are negative, at least if we think about preserving the rare species, but there are exceptions. If you look at these acidic grasslands, there are one or two other studies than the ones I've shown you, showing that some of the soil environment is more suitable or more favorable again for the specialist species than they have been 20 or 30 years ago. Another conclusion is that the patterns that we see, they depend, of course, on the length of the time interval. So if you have 70 years, you can expect more change than if you have only 20 years. But they also depend on the start of the time interval that you look at. So if you look at changes happening over the last 10 or 20 years, you may have different drivers than the ones that were important when you look at a change that already have started in the 50s or 60s and continue until today. And finally, and that is perhaps the most important thing, I think it is meaningful to distinguish different types of or subtypes of grasslands, not only the main habitat types, I would say, like I used here with wet grasslands, acidic grasslands, and so on, but that you also go in detail into the different subtypes because they may respond differently to the environmental drivers. And this is especially important, I would say, in calcareous grasslands, which are perhaps the most extreme type of grassland, and which is the type of grassland which is likely to respond most to climate change effects. Yeah, and by this, this is my last slide. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to answer questions.
That was really fascinating, Martin. Thank you very much. Very much food for thought. Does anybody have any questions?
Johannes.
Johannes.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. Really, that was a great summary of all the nice work you have been doing in the past years or decades. I appreciate very much the combination of factors you have looked at the time series and different grassland types and so on. Asking for something you have not addressed would be looking at area effects. So you could also expect that some of the changes you see is due to reduced area. So fragmentation, maybe also edge effects, lack of dispersal and so on. So how is that to be seen in your results?
I must admit that in my grassland studies, I have rarely addressed this. I have worked on these fragmentation effects in my forest studies because forests are really fragmented in the area where I work. So here it's really it's a good setting for study this. But I must say in the studies I've shown you about acidic grasslands and the calcareous grasslands, I have not really addressed this issue. So I cannot, I mean, we know from some of the studies by others that some of the calcareous grassland plants suffer a lot from small population sizes and isolation, like Gentianella germanica or so. But I haven't worked with that specifically. So I couldn't. Probably there are a lot of effects, but I couldn't tell.
Thank you.
Okay, I think the next question was from Szymon Krzyzewski. I think I accidentally switched off your hand.
No problem. Thank you. Super interesting talk. Thank you very much. I was wondering, because I came from Poland, now I'm doing my master's in Switzerland. And it seems like when you go over borders, the same grasslands, they seem to differ a lot. So like because of the local land use and whatever. And I'm just wondering, like, what do you think, how much generalizability there is, like how much we can generalize these results, for example, to Eastern Europe or the Southern or like some other countries? Yeah, this was what I was wondering.
I'm not sure if the results can be extended to, let's say, Southern Europe, but I would be quite confident that the patterns I've shown you are also, let's say, valid or true in other Central European countries. I mean, in two of these studies, we have included other countries than Germany. I know I've worked in Sweden also for a while, and I know that the dynamics, at least of calcareous grasslands, are very similar to the dynamics we see here, with a lot of nature conservation actions, but still slowly a slow loss of species and a slow change in species composition. I think in Great Britain it's a similar pattern. I think, although not in detail, but I think the general trends I would expect are quite similar also in other countries. I couldn't tell for the more continental parts of Europe, and I couldn't tell for the Mediterranean areas.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Okay, we'll take the next question from Timo Conradi, and then we'll look at the questions that are in the chat. There's a few questions there as well, but Timo first.
Yeah, thank you very much for the really interesting presentation. I was wondering what your thoughts are about how we should change the management of these open ecosystems, given that we can already see such strong effects of the climatic exposure of these open ecosystems. And I mean, we are only now at the beginning of the climatic changes that are forecast to accelerate. And obviously these open ecosystems are hit the strongest by all these climatic changes. So is there something we can do about, for example, managing the microclimate in these systems in order to maintain the ability of these ecosystems to maintain their high species richness?
I mean, I think that the nature conservation authorities already do a lot. I mean, the wet grasslands in my area here around Bremen, they are really kept in a very good shape, I would say. So over 2 decades, we could show that in this monitoring study, I think they hardly lose species. They still, I would say they still focus in their actions on birds, because the birds are the big issue here in our grasslands. But in most cases, it's also good for plants, not in all cases. For the other grasslands, I think it's difficult, especially in the case of calcareous grasslands. I mean, if climate change gets even more dramatic, then I think it's simply very difficult to manage them well. I mean, as we have shown, the north exposed or the less extreme calcareous grasslands, they are in a very good shape. I mean, they have even gained specialist species over the last decade at least. But I'm not sure if there's anything you can do about these extreme sites. And probably this is even more pronounced in areas which anyway are drier, for example, in the southeastern parts of Germany. I don't know, Bavaria perhaps, or in the areas in the rain shadow of the Harz Mountains. I'm not sure if those really, I think they will get a problem in the long run. But that's speculation, of course.
Okay, if we move on to 1 or 2 questions from the chat. Kevin sent a question: what characterizes dry grasslands in Germany?
In general, I would say, well, a more or less base-rich bedrock or soil with pH values higher than 6, sometimes higher than 7, or often higher than 7. Of course, they are relatively shallow soils, usually, often on south exposed slopes. They are relatively dry. And they have a very typical species composition of a lot of specialist species. So it's, and of course there are then differences across the country with even more species in the southern part of the country. So where we have studied them, these are the last outposts, I would say, of this habitat type. I mean, here in my area around Bremen, of course, we have no calcareous grasslands, not a single one.
Really?
Okay. Yeah, there is simply no calcareous bedrock, nothing.
Yeah.
The best we have is here our dikes. They are sometimes a bit more, calcareous, but in the best case you can find some of the species, but otherwise I have to drive 150 kilometers to reach the next calcareous grasslands.
Okay. Then there was a follow-up question from the same person. Any effects of fires, grazing animals, introduced or invasive species in affecting vegetation change in the grassland studies?
Yeah, we try to include in this paper that I told you about at the end. I didn't mention that explicitly, but we try to analyze management because some of these grasslands are mown, some are grazed, some have a mixed management. Sometimes the management has changed, but it is very hard to analyze the effects of management, because sometimes, you have to rely on what people tell you about management, and that is not always easy to know. So we usually ask the people who give us the permission to work there how the management is, but we not always get a conclusive answer. So we have, I think Leonie used this as a variable, and didn't end up as being significant, but perhaps also because we mainly analyzed the change, and most of these grasslands have relatively constant management. So either they are mown or they are grazed, and that doesn't change so much, or hasn't changed so much.
Okay, the next question's from Willy Verbeke. And he asked, did you see a diminishing through drought of Gentianella species and more of Picris hierarchoides?
No, because both were extremely rare in our data set. I think we had only one site with Gentianella.
Yeah.
And with Picris, I even can't remember that we have seen it at all. What I can say is that we have some species that show very strong dynamics, which we are not sure about. Perhaps we see a strong increase in Bromus erectus at the expense of Brachypodium. That is one change that we have seen, and we have seen a strong increase in Rhinanthus electorolophus, which I also don't know why this happened. So there are a couple of species that have a fast dynamics, but I'm not sure what the reason for this is.
Yeah, it's a complex situation. Next was David Wormsley, and he asks, are there any studies on changes in the species richness and or abundance within the seed bank?
I have no idea. We haven't studied seed banks here. We have studied them in the wet grasslands, but that was one single study. I, in fact, tried to recruit students to do work on seed banks, but it has not been very popular here, working with seed banks. People are afraid of all the work, I think.
Yeah. And then Didem has a question. How permanent do you think is the effect of one very dry year on the vegetation? Will it be a noise in the long-term data or a major driver?
I don't know, because after these exceptionally dry years of 18 and 19, even 20 was a relatively dry year. So what we would need to answer that would be normal years, 1, 2, 3 normal years, in order to see whether there is a recovery. But I think we had at least 3 years in a row with extremely dry situations, with lower precipitation values than usual, and I would believe that some of these changes will not return to normal, so to say. I think they will be there, because I think also that the probability that we see more drought years will increase. So, but of course, it can go back in. But of course, species get lost faster than they reappear again.
Yeah, this is something we've also seen in Finland recently with the effects of drought in the Åland archipelago on the host plant of the Melidia kingsia, which has caused big losses in some areas. Okay, Vicky Temperton has the next question.
Yes, first of all, I'd like to also say thank you very much for this very amazing overview. And it's so powerful to have this long-term data. And first of all, I'd just like to comment that it kind of fits with other data that we're seeing at the moment, with like numbers of species and species richness, the turnover rate. So it kind of correlates well with that. What I'm thinking about, though, is more this thing of like where you say the calcareous grassland on the south-facing slopes, they're going to be most in danger. My question that pops up in my head is like, what could happen to it if it became more extreme? Would it just become, what would it turn into? And related to that question is, if you look at like the resilience or the resistance of different kinds of habitats, then I'd say a lot of these grasslands are actually surprisingly resilient. Obviously, in the case of the calcareous grassland in the south-facing slopes, less so, but they're surprisingly resilient compared to, say, other habitats like, say, shrubland and forests from the research. But the research itself is often not comparing those habitats. So maybe comment on that from your feeling about, if you think about restoration, it's a really big dilemma, isn't it? What are we going to restore where, taking these changes and limits into account? It's a really wicked problem. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Like, what would that calcareous grassland potentially change into? Would it just become a desertified site? And what should we do, like, in terms of the relative response to these systems?
I honestly don't know. I think perhaps it's even necessary to not to have this separation of just south-facing, north-facing, but to look at this as a kind of gradient. And perhaps then it turns out that perhaps there is a species replacement. So perhaps one of the more drought tolerant, maybe they move from the south facing to the north facing slopes in order to survive. And I don't know. I think it's a result that surprised us, but we believe that therefore it's worth to look more into the internal dynamics of grasslands, because many grasslands are, if there is, for example, a kind of small hill, then it has really these different sides, and perhaps it would be worth to install permanent plots where you really monitor the dynamics of single species in comparison of different sites over several years, in order to see whether they move, or perhaps they are also too slow to be able to move. But I think there is I believe that in the long run there is probably not much you can do about it. I mean, these south-facing slopes, although they lose species, they still have some very rare species that preferably occur on these south-facing slopes. So it's not that they are without species already now, but it's simply that the dynamics are much different from the north-facing ones. So, but I have so far no good idea what to recommend to a nature conservation agency, except that they should probably set up a very good monitoring program, which we have set since 20 years, of course. But that's something which is really necessary, I think.
Okay, so the calcareous grasslands in the south-facing slopes might remain calcareous grasslands, just poorer.
Yeah, probably. I would think
so.
Yeah, they might be stable, and some species are perhaps. I mean, the vernal species, I would expect that they do not suffer as much as the summer growing or flowering species. So it's probably also a matter of when the drought comes, whether it comes in the summer or in the spring. We haven't analyzed that so far.
No, thank you.
Martin, how are you doing? Do you still have energy to address more questions?
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, the next one is from Solvi de Rosina. She says, it was a great pleasure to listen to your lecture. Many thanks. My question is about phosphorus in relation to habitat modification. It's reported to be the main problem in relation to soil nutrients for species richness, especially in Nardus grasslands. Do nitrogen Ellenberg values indicate also phosphorus problem or not? And are the nitrogen and phosphorus amount always related?
So that's a difficult question, because I think the Ellenberg values are just an indication of some nutrients, and it's not possible to say whether it's nitrogen or phosphorus or so. The good thing is that phosphorus is usually not transported via the atmosphere. So if a calcareous grasslands is nutrient poor, it stays nutrient poor even if the surrounding is fertilized. So because I think the transport is not very efficient of phosphorus to neighboring sites, which is very good, because nitrogen deposition is a problem, but phosphorus deposition is not. And for calcareous grasslands, I know that the share of threatened specialist species increases with decreasing phosphorus. So phosphorus is one of the main factors deciding about whether a calcareous grassland is really very species rich in terms of these specialist species or not. I have not much experience from acidic grasslands because phosphorus is it's not so easy to measure, and it's also there are few older phosphorus measurements that would allow us to know whether phosphorus contents have increased or decreased. So I couldn't really tell. In calcareous grasslands, I think it's one of the main factors that keeps them species rich, because nitrogen deposition, even if it is high, many species cannot use the extra nitrogen if they not at the same time also have more phosphorus, which they don't have.
Okay, I'm going to take host prerogative now and use my own question while we still have time and energy. You mentioned about the wet grasslands at the beginning and the delayed disappearance of species. So I guess that's an example of what we could call extinction debt. And I was thinking, you said that you plan to initiate new sampling in these sites, possibly next year or the next year after that. I was thinking it might be an interesting exercise if on the 3 years data you already have, you try to predict the extinction debt, and then that would be like an a priori thing that you could test when you do the new sampling, and you might find that you predict them very accurately. You might find there's some surprises which might then help also to predict what would happen subsequently.
Yeah, that's I haven't thought about that, but that's a good idea. So I think it's a part of that story is extinction debt, but another part is probably that, although it's hard to believe that, but farmers still intensify their land use here.
Yeah.
I mean, you would believe that it's not possible any longer to have even more intensive land use, but obviously it is. You can even put even more fertilizer or even more lime, or you drain even better. So these two effects are probably not easy to disentangle.
Yeah. Okay, we still have a couple of questions in the chat and one request. The next one is from Thomas Cerny, and he asks, which drivers do you consider to be most dangerous or detrimental to the species composition of grasslands in the long term? Are they environmental changes such as atmospheric deposition, groundwater pollution, climatic change, or direct management modifications such as uncontrolled management, intensification, and abandonment?
Well, I think that in order to keep semi-natural grasslands in a good shape, you definitely need good management and constant management. But I would say that the apart from that, the drivers are different. So I mean, for wet grasslands, I think atmospheric deposition is not so important because they are not as nutrient poor as acidic grasslands or calcareous grasslands. So climate change, I would believe that definitely that climate change is a very important factor in the long run. In acidic grasslands, I would think that climate change perhaps is not as important, but there are signs that perhaps the high winter temperatures also have an effect on the species composition. So the fact that low frost events are less frequent.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, this looks like it could be the final question, and it's Johannes.
Thank you. You do allow another question. I also believe this nutrient issue is still a very strong thing. and that it has been increasing in the past years is also very obvious. Just looking at one of my webcams here, south of Chiemsee, there is a hilly landscape about 800 meters above sea level. Yesterday, the first real snow came, and the day before, the slurry was sent out. So all the green, very green meadows that I remember from my childhood being very species rich are green, 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 and then brown, and then the snow comes. So let's see how it goes. My question is maybe also to the rest of the audience. Maybe somebody knows how we can infer about past site conditions by looking at herbarium examples. Maybe Martin, you have done that. I guess also you have in Bremen, you have an enormous herbarium, and you could take pieces of these plants and maybe look at the CN ratio, or you could look at the phosphorus nitrogen ratio, or do isotope investigations, given all the limitations that maybe they have been stored under not ideal conditions. But does anybody know whether or not there's an opportunity looking at this old material to infer how the site conditions was? Maybe it was a grassland as it was now, but still the nitrogen situation was different. Have you heard, or has anybody heard about that method to infer past environmental conditions?
It's a great idea, but I haven't worked on that. But I remember that a couple of years ago I had plans to do so, but then we forgot about it because a colleague of mine found a very old chair, and the chair was full of hay from probably from the 19th century, and we had the idea that we would analyze the hay, also trying to identify the species, but then the material was so disintegrated in the end that we forgot about the project. But that would be a great thing, of course, to do.
Maybe we can do it in a coordinated. Maybe also Vicky knows about whether or not isotopes, isotope ratios would work.
Yeah, I guess with the 13C, you could look at changes potentially in water use efficiency, but with the 15N, it's always a question what it would tell you, right? Because it's so variable, and you probably could separate legumes and non-legumes nicely, but otherwise I don't really know what that would tell you. But I think it's a great idea using herbaria and having a look at CN NP ratios.
Yeah.
Maybe I think I have heard of somebody doing this, but I can't remember where.
I've never heard.
Definitely
maybe
people using herbaria.
Maybe Stefan has heard.
Sorry?
Maybe Stefan has heard.
No, I not heard, but I remember when there was an anniversary of Rothamsted, they showed us the old samples of hay in glasses, and maybe they analyzed this, and so to search on this question, it would be useful to have a look at the Rothamsted results, at their publication records and so on, because they have a long tradition in this, and I've seen this very old funny hay probes in glasses.
You're right. Yeah.
What I suggest we do now, there are still 33 people here. Someone's just put a comment now about this last question. But the chat just jumped now. Yeah, Martin Diekmann from Utrecht University is dealing a lot with the above ground biomass of N, P and K ratios in grassland in his research studies, and a lot can be inferred from this. What I suggest to do now, I'm going to switch the recording off, and anyone who wants to continue discussing freely now is welcome to stay and do so. And if everybody disappears, then I'll switch everything off. But if not, if anybody wants to continue having discussions about this, then that's fine. The pressure's off you now, Martin. Okay. So,
but I can stay in. I'm happy to answer questions. Yeah.